Welcome to Accommodate This. My name is David, and I'm a late diagnosed autistic adult. I make videos about autism and the neurodivergent experience, so if that's something you're interested in, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. Autism is a spectrum disorder, which means it's a group of related conditions that can include a range of symptoms and traits. Traits commonly associated with autism include difficulties with social communication and repetitive behaviors. But because of the truly broad nature of autism and how it may be expressed, there's very little understanding of the condition among the general public. My hope is that by educating others about autism, it will not only increase understanding, but it will also foster more acceptance and cut through the stigma that exists. And now that you know why we're here, let's get into the topic for this video, the real autism spectrum. The word spectrum inspires mental images of rainbows and gauges, implying it's a defined set of traits that can be measured from mild to severe or high functioning to low functioning. But spectrum disorders are simply groups of related conditions that can include a range of symptoms and traits. According to the current Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM-5, autistic individuals have persistent deficits in 3 areas of social communication and interaction, and 2 or more areas of restricted repetitive behaviors. The word persistent is important here because assessors have to be able to distinguish a behavioral phase or a developmental delay from a more permanent structural brain difference, at which point they will assign a severity level to inform others of the level of support the autistic person may need. And while the current diagnostic levels are an improvement over previous models, many autistics, including myself, don't think they accurately describe the condition, and they may lead people to assume that autism exists on a line between low functioning and high functioning. Autism is typically defined as a condition affecting communication and social behaviors. Research has traditionally taken a narrow scope focusing only on the common behaviors associated with autism. But if we were to look at all human behavior in a broader sense, we would find autistics have spiky profiles across the board. What does that mean? Well, imagine listing every human behavioral trait on a graph, and then measuring each trait to show which ones were strengths or weaknesses for that person. Then connect each point with a line. If you're measuring neurotypical behaviors, you're likely to get a wavy pattern like the orange line in this graph. However, measuring autistic behaviors will often result in spikes, similar to the blue line, where we either excel or where we experience deficits compared to the average neurotypical person. From an image like this, it would be easy to conclude that the autistic person experiences all kinds of behavioral deficits compared to the average person. But that would be a narrow way to look at it. What it actually describes is that autistic behaviors should not be judged the same as neurotypical behaviors. A neurotypical person may have a more flat behavioral profile, implying that they behave as expected, and they neither excel nor struggle with a wide range of behaviors. On the other hand, autistics tend to excel at specific behaviors or in limited situations. What may be considered normal behaviors don't necessarily come naturally to us, and we might need supports when we fall short. You may have also seen the autistic spectrum illustrated using a wheel. This example is based on a test that compares autistic traits to various neurotypical standards. The measurement of each trait is illustrated by filling in a wedge with a color. The closer to the center of the wedge, the more severe the deficit is for that trait. The closer to the outer edge, the more closely that trait is aligned with what is understood to be normal function. So a completely full wheel is representative of a neurotypical person, while autistic individuals are expected to have deficits in multiple wedges. While graphs like this are better at explaining the autistic spectrum than a single line, it still has many issues. For one, it describes autism by way of deficits, hoisting the neurotypical brain to an ideal state. And for another, it's not a complete picture. Many autistics excel in different ways, sometimes surpassing the neurotypical ability. But none of that can be illustrated in a graph of this nature. So, while these graphs are good at illustrating that autism isn't a straight line between high functioning and low functioning, it still focuses on deficits, distorting our view of the full picture. Cognitive tests help specialists make educated guesses about autistic behavioral expression, but they are heavily reliant on the assessor's ability to interpret those behaviors. Focusing on social symptoms prioritizes the comfort of everyone else above the needs of the autistic individual. And treatments such as applied behavioral analysis, or ABA therapy, are often based on conditioning the autistic individual to ignore their own natural impulses, to suppress their instincts, and to act more neurotypical so that other people won't reject them. Testing must evolve to become more humane, and we need more definitive ways of measurement that are more conclusive and less prone to bias. The human brain is a complex organ, and we've only scratched the surface in unraveling its secrets. There's a lot more to be understood, and research is making advancements all the time. While autistic brains are often portrayed as deficient, there's no true ideal brain configuration for comparison. Every brain is different, and every configuration of the human brain is as valid as the next. Studies focused on brain structure have found a large number of connections between brain regions in autistics. And at various milestones in brain development, autistic brains often contain abnormally large cells or an increased density of cells in various regions. Unfortunately, traditional studies have used a comparative model that stacks us up against the majority and describes the differences as dysregulated when they don't match the popular average. And this contributes to stigma and the belief that autistic individuals are somehow fundamentally flawed or malfunctioning human beings that must learn to conform or must be cured or treated somehow so we become more neurotypical. But that perspective is dehumanizing and packed with unrealistic expectations. Those expectations only serve to further marginalize us and limit humanity's overall understanding. I recognize a full assessment of the entire brain is probably out of reach with our current technology, so it makes sense for assessors to attempt to simplify the assessment process by focusing on brain regions that are known to be associated with common autistic traits. However, this only addresses a handful of the commonly shared traits and doesn't fully describe the range of differences possible across the autistic population. The connections that create the scaffolding for the autistic brain may be far reaching, connecting areas that aren't necessarily adjacent to each other, connecting areas positioned in one extreme region to another opposite region, leading to all kinds of interesting effects. Limiting our understanding by referring to these differences only in part, and then further limiting them to a definition of deficits, may make diagnosis faster to assess, but it doesn't do justice to the full range of traits that can be expressed by an autistic brain. And framing our differences as deficits only serves to marginalize us further and ignore our true potential. Apples and oranges can both be sweet, but they still taste wildly different. The same is true for neurotypical brains and autistic brains. Not that I know how they taste. I'm saying our brains develop differently, and our brains drive our behaviors. The differences in autistic versus neurotypical brain development are so vast, they're as different as apples are to oranges. And yet we're typically all judged the same. For example, autistics make excellent employees due to our honest and loyal nature, eye for detail, and out-of-the-box thinking. And we often excel at our jobs when provided the proper supports. However, employers often make the mistake of assuming if we're good at one task, we must be able to adapt to another that's related to it, and we should be able to adapt just as well as the neurotypical person can. But studies have shown time and again that that just isn't the case for autistics. So in their attempts to treat every employee the same, employers end up discriminating against autistic staff by holding them to the same behavioral expectations across the board, misunderstanding the drivers behind the behaviors, and essentially expecting us to overcome our disability. And this can lead to the idea that autism is a condition deserving of elimination because of how disruptive it can be to the rest of society. But autism isn't only about social deficits. The temporal cortex is a particularly important region of the brain that is significantly impacted by autism. The temporal cortex is also responsible for immunity function, inflammatory response, interferons, which are the proteins that help the body fight infections, cancers, and autoimmune diseases, as well as neurodevelopmental and cellular functions, not just social behaviors. And the complexity of the brain is why there is no cure to be had for autism. Because even if you were somehow able to figure out how to reconfigure the brain by disconnecting specific neurons and reconnecting them in a way that matches a normal brain configuration, all you would end up with is a different brain than the one you started with. So the cure, therefore, would just result in an entirely different person with a different personality. And that's not something we should even be considering. I've spent a lot of time talking about autistic behaviors and the impacts of autism on the brain, because that's where most of the research has focused for decades. However, research is expanding in some exciting new directions in recent years. Scientists have identified roughly 200 genes associated with autism, further underscoring the complexity of this condition. We know autistics tend to have sensory issues and dietary issues, but none of those symptoms are currently included in the diagnostic criteria. But scientists are getting closer to understanding the connection in autism. CHD8 is the most common gene mutation found in autistics, and that particular gene is important to the development of teeth, eyes, lungs, the heart, the gut, and the brain. More and more, scientists are realizing that autism is not just a behavioral or brain disorder. Autism is a whole body disorder. A more holistic and compassionate approach may be needed in order to fully understand the wide range of traits associated with autism. Most assessments compare autistics to the average neurotypical, suggesting the average neurotypical model is the pinnacle of what a human is supposed to be. But nowhere else does it make sense to present the average anything as the pinnacle model. So this is just one more way that autism assessments are inherently biased. But we have to start somewhere. Unfortunately, while an autistic diagnosis is difficult to obtain, it may not actually be the eye-opening event many of us look forward to. And I'm not saying that a diagnosis isn't worth seeking. Speaking for myself, I found it quite validating, and yet it was lacking in many ways. My diagnosis did not give me any insights into what it meant to be autistic. It did not provide me any deeper understanding, nor did it open any doors to accommodations or strategies to help me adjust to life as an autistic person in a world that's not designed for me. I can't really fault the assessor for this failure, and it's not even necessarily fair for me to call it a failure. It simply was as far as our understanding could take us at the time. If anything, It accentuates just how much more work needs to be done. After all, it took us decades to map the brains of fruit flies. It's going to be several more decades before we have a complete understanding of the human brain, which is thousands of times more complex. And while I'm dissatisfied with the pace of our progress, I'm grateful progress is still being made. And I'm hopeful for the future and what it can mean for the autistic community. So, what is the spectrum if it isn't based solely on common autistic behavioral traits? Well, the spectrum is open-ended. While we may share common traits, we're all different in many ways. Autistics share a cluster of conditions that medical scientists call autistic traits, but that doesn't describe our full experience or even what is possible. Much like the electromagnetic spectrum, only a tiny portion is visible to the human eye, but there's much more beyond what we see. The same is true for the autistic experience, in that we may share common traits, but the fact remains that our entire brain developed differently, and the genes responsible for those differences also impact the rest of our bodies. To say those few diagnostic traits in the DSM-5 represent the entire spectrum of autistic expression would be the same as denying the existence of all the other frequencies that we know about outside the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The real autism spectrum may be easier to define by what it is not. It's not a defined set of common behaviors, and it's not confined to a few brain regions. It's not the same for everyone, nor does it impact everyone to the same degree. It's not purely expressed in deficits, nor is it a single way to experience the world. The truth is that the autism spectrum is simply a deviation from the norm. It's a neurotype that is no better or worse than any other neurotype. It's a different brain structure that is no more valid or less valid than the next. It's a series of complex genetic mutations that expresses themselves in some harsh ways and some beautiful ways. The autistic spectrum is like color enriching a bland landscape of sameness. And currently, it's an under-tapped resource that could open our world to endless possibilities if given the opportunity. And from that perspective, the full spectrum has yet to be seen. If you enjoyed this video, please comment, like, and subscribe to see more content like this. Until next time, thank you for watching.